May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer.
Amen.
Amen. How much is a human life worth? What is the value in silver and gold, dollars and cents that you can put on a single human life? Well, for Christians, the answer is simple. We are all created in God's image, and God sent God's only Son to be with us and to be sacrificed and to be raised again. So there is no value that can be put on a human life because each and every one of our lives is infinitely valuable. We hear today the lesson of the Israelites who created the molten image of the golden calf and circled around it with dances and praises. Of course, the Lord's wrath is kindled against his people who turned against him, the very one who gave them their lives and saved their lives, rescuing them out from slavery and bondage in Egypt into this new land. How quickly they turned on him. How quickly they decided to turn to another God. Of course, this isn't just any other God. This is a God of their own creation. It is a God that is shiny and sparkly like gold, that looks valuable. And that is the God that they have chosen to worship. Moses pleads on behalf of his people and says that basically, from now on, we are going to have a contract with God. We know that this God of our own creation, the little one, the one of the golden calf, is forever going to be out there, floating, walking around. And in our weaker moments, or even in our stronger ones, we will always be tempted to go back and worship that. But if God will be gracious and patient, then we will keep our ears open for the call to return to the Lord who gives us our true value, not the golden calf, but our God who created us, saves us, gives us the beauty of this life, not just to us, but to each and every human being on the face of this planet. From that moment on, there is a conflict that is inaugurated, both in the human soul and in society. We are always going to be pulled over to that place of the golden calf, looking for it, looking for value in that idol, the one that we ourselves have created. It is a constant struggle, one passed down from generation to generation. And it's not an easy one to confront. You know, I first preached as a priest about this text just a couple weeks after the financial crisis of 2008. And that memory is seared into my mind. There was absolutely no mistaking that this text, which was written so many centuries ago, applied to us here in the 21st century. And I learned then that this is an ongoing story, and one that is especially relevant for a society that is as money and material obsessed as tomorrow is Indigenous Peoples Day. And this is a time for the church, for Christians, to stand up and to say that every human life has value. That the sins of the past are ours to take responsibility for, and the way that we have treated Indigenous peoples over the centuries truly is a sin, that we were worshiping a golden calf as a church. The people at All Saints have been incredibly generous with me when I go down my little historical rabbit holes, especially in the past couple of months. On Founders Day in September, we talked about the church was founded in 1867 and what was going on in the world then, in the middle of Reconstruction. The sins that were not resolved at that time, we were still grappling with the outcome of that. Back in the summer, when the Senate was debating a bill to change the names of military installations named after Confederate generals, we talked about the fact that one of those bases was named after the Episcopal Bishop of Louisiana, Leonidas Polk, who became a major general in the Confederate Army. Our church's history is interwoven with both the good and the bad in the history of this country. And the same is true of our relationship with indigenous peoples on this continent. This summer, I took my vacation in northern Michigan, which is a place I've been going to since I was a little kid, and people in my life are truly scared to talk about. But nonetheless, here we go. This year, I found myself, after the pandemic, just wanting to see that familiar night sky, wanting to see the lakes and the forests, to reconnect with the land and the water in the way that I have since I was a little kid. And one thing that occurred to me shortly after I'd gotten there was that there were people living in this place who I sort of vaguely knew about, but had a much deeper connection with the land and the water and the sky than I did. And that I had never really taken the time to learn about the culture of the indigenous people of the upper Midwest. I sort of fell down one of those rabbit holes again because I realized I had a lot of learning to do in order to catch up, learning about the Anishinaabe Odawa people who live in northern Michigan. I started following indigenous people on Twitter and learning some basic phrases in Anishinaabemowin, which is the language that is spoken by Odawa people. I availed myself of all the resources that I could on the internet and spent several hours a day on my vacation just learning, soaking up this knowledge and trying to learn about the perspective of indigenous people because, quite frankly, I don't have many meaningful relationships with indigenous people, and that's part of the problem. One of the things I learned that is a constant complaint among indigenous people is a lack of visibility. We teach our children in this country that at one time there were people on this continent and then they're gone. I mean, they're still kind of there, but they're gone. They're not really, I mean, when you go back and watch the narratives and the way people think and talk about Native people in this country, it's this weird kind of thing where like they're here, but they're not here. They're a part of the past, not really in the present, but sort of there. It's a terrible, terrible cultural moment for us. And so I learned more to try to make my eyes open to the visibility of Native people and certainly the way that my own history has interacted with theirs. A related nation to the Odawa Nation are the Ojibwe people who live largely in Minnesota. And I found out about a wonderful book that I read called Hole in the Day by Anton Troyer. Hole in the Day was an Ojibwe chief in Minnesota in the mid-19th century. And he was active during the time when the US government was negotiating with Ojibwe people about what to do about the land. They knew, Americans knew, that there were vast iron ore reserves and logging Minnesota, and in the mid-19th century, those resources still had not been exploited. The problem was that there were these people who were living there and had lived there for centuries. And what ensued was a story tried of the US government interacting with Native peoples not in good faith, but in bad faith. In 1867, the very same year that our church was founded, the Ojibwe people signed a treaty with the US government that would have effectively removed all of them from their land to one reservation, White Lake, in Minnesota. This agreement was signed in part by Ojibwe people who had business interests in this whole thing and who were going to get peanuts. And Poland Day, the subject of this book, was traveling to Washington in 1867 to protest this action when he was assassinated, actually by other Ojibwe people. What's interesting is sorry, we're having some sound issues. as always. What's interesting about this whole story to me was the role of the Episcopal Church in the white colonization of Minnesota at the time. The very first missionary bishop to Minnesota was a man named Henry Whipple, and I actually wrote a term paper about him in seminary. Sorry, I should go, okay. Guys, you know, we try every single week. Since it's possible that you weren't able to hear part of the sermon, how's that? Sounding a little better? Okay. Let's just cut to the chase. Americans have not valued the lives of Indigenous people in this country. And this colonial legacy is one that we have internalized. Because if you start to ask the question, what is the value of a human life, and you put a price tag on it, it actually becomes a game that you can play. And it's one that's playing out right now in this COVID crisis. You know, I read an article that estimated, it was in Science magazine, that estimated that the cost of a year-long lockdown in the United States would have cost about $3 trillion to the economy. If we wouldn't have had the lockdown at all, it would have added $3 trillion to the economy. But it would have meant that we would lose about 500,000 people. Well, if you take that and you sort of divide it out, that means that the value of a human life is about $6 million. So, do you think that your life is worth $6 million? Do you think the life of your children or your grandchildren or your spouse is $6 million? Every person, if we didn't lock down our country, who we would sacrifice to the economy, would have added roughly $6 million to our wealth. And isn't that a pretty messed up way of looking at the world? This is a legacy of our history that is relevant to the way that people who came from Europe treated indigenous peoples in this country and continue to this day, because there are still bitter fights over the value of life in the face of extractive resources in this country and around the world. And to me, it all goes back to that story about the golden calf. When we start to circle that golden calf and worship it, our eyes just turn into dollar signs. There is no such thing as something that is actually sacred unless it's connected to money and material wealth. And that includes human life. But the call is always still there to us to be able to return to God, return to Jesus, who treated everyone like they were of infinite value, who gave his own life, which was, of course, itself invaluable, for our own invaluable lives. All of this is a change of heart. We are always going to be tugged toward that golden calf, toward that idol that is sitting there just waiting for us to dance around it like the Israelites on that day. And part of the role of a community like ours, of a Christian community, of the church, is to call the people back, to remind them of what human life is really worth, to remind them of what God has actually given to all of us. So, tomorrow, as we observe Indigenous Peoples Day, and as we go forward in our lives during this insane period of time, I invite you to meditate on the value of human life. What is the value of a human life? Well, the value of a human life is infinite, because it was given to us by the God who, God's self, is infinite. Amen.